The Tragic Life of Judy Garland. The Tragic Life of Judy Garland. Uncovering the Dark Secrets. 11 tragic stories about the life of Judy Garland. 15 tragic stories about the life of Judy Garland. Oh, now we're talking. The Tragic Story of Judy Garland. Tragic details about Judy Garland. The tragic real-life story of Judy Garland.
Fellas, one of your favorite combinations, Judy Garland singing Over the Rainbow.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby.
What do you think of when you think of the name Judy Garland? This is a question that's primarily geared to people who don't know a lot about her life, particularly of my generation. I'm willing to bet you either think, oh, that's Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, or, oh, her life was so sad and so tragic, it's so terrible what they did to her. There has been a plethora of tabloid fodder and rumors about Judy Garland for as long as she's been around, but this has taken a new form in recent years. Through the internet. Things like YouTube or TikTok. Not that TikTok. Many of you might already know that we're in an age of misinformation where the very concept of objective truth is fading. You know how it goes. Zoomers believe everything they see on TikTok. Boomers believe everything they see on Facebook, without any sources or further research. This can be attributed to a few things. A lack of critical thinking from the general failures of the education systems in place, or perhaps the fact it's easier to just mindlessly believe something without any further questions because people just need to believe in something. The truth is often a lot more complicated than people might think, and that's hard. Thinking is hard. We need clear-cut heroes and villains like it's a Disney movie. It's comforting to think like that. Black and white thinking is easy. I could go on and on about the critical thinking, but I'm going to focus on how it relates to the topic at hand. The Wizard of Oz is estimated to be the most watched movie of all time by the Library of Congress. It is essentially the de facto American fairy tale. Most people have seen it, and most people that haven't generally know the main plot points. It's been widely regarded as an incredible piece of wholesome family entertainment for decades. But things tend to exist on a pendulum that swings back and forth. You see this in politics, you see this in media, and The Wizard of Oz is no exception. One of the casualties of online misinformation has been this movie and the people in it. And of course its star, Judy Garland, and some of the people who were in her life as collateral damage. Judy Garland's life and The Wizard of Oz in general has been sort of fetishized into a glorified ghost story that you tell around a campfire. People love the contrast, the dichotomy of this wholesome, beloved family movie was actually dark and creepy behind the scenes. Ooh. Look no further than a false claim that is often regurgitated about Judy Garland's diet consisting of black coffee and 80 cigarettes a day. Now, it shouldn't really require much research to know why this doesn't make sense. It's mathematically impossible. But this is a claim that is cited by supposedly reputable outlets such as Newsweek and The Telegraph, even though it quite literally makes no sense. Something I'll say right out the gate is that yes, Judy Garland did have a hard life in many respects. I'm not saying every single thing you've heard about her is false. But what I am saying is that there are certain claims about Judy that are just not true, or at best have pretty dubious sources. That, or there are things about her life that are sorely lacking the context and empathy required to really understand her as a person. Because that's kind of the core of all this, isn't it? Judy Garland was a person. And that's easy to forget to some people. The Wizard of Oz is such a larger-than-life thing that people kind of forget she's not just Dorothy Gale. And I think that's honestly always been part of why people have had such a difficult time understanding her. She's not just this figurine that exists in this personified snow globe meant for your consumption and enjoyment. People heard that Judy Garland was facing hardships in her life, and they took that and turned it into tabloid fodder. They were perplexed. Dorothy Gale doesn't do this, Dorothy Gale doesn't do that, and some people viewed that as a betrayal. The thing is that Judy Garland in some ways was Dorothy Gale, but she was a myriad of other things, just like everyone else. Human beings tend to be walking contradictions and an internal melting pot of various entities, but people don't like that. It has to be one thing or the other, meaning they'll deride Judy for being human, or they'll say her entire life was a disaster and remove all agency from her to say that the entire world was plotting her demise, and thus flanderize Judy Garland into this one thing: tragedy, which is something she actually deeply disliked. The flanderization of Judy Garland into this one trait is disrespectful in a lot of ways, and just dehumanizing. And yes, it's tragic that Judy Garland passed away at the age that she did. It's tragic that bad things happened to her. But what about all the other components and context here that goes ignored? Or what about the things that aren't even true that are perpetuated largely to contribute to this narrative? Meaning, what I wanted to accomplish here was an examination of what is true and what is not true. But I needed help wading through the endless amount of content you see online about Judy. So I enlisted the aid of someone who was often considered to be the top Judy Garland historian, John Fricke.
My name is John Fricke, as you've told them. From the time I fell for all this, for Oz and Judy, when I was 5, 6 years old, I was a big take me to the library kind of kid. And when I found out in the next few years that you could do research about these topics at the library, I was looking at every book, every old newspaper, every old magazine that I could trace that had information about Judy or Oz. And this then extended to the Northwestern University Library, where they had different periodicals. And by the time I got to New York, I had, was just looking for whatever I could. I was fascinated with not her personal life and not anything like that. I wanted to know about the movies and the shows and all of that, how it came together. And then I started doing the professional jobs, and it was like a snowball that turned into an avalanche, because one job led to another. The 50th anniversary Oz book led to the 50th anniversary video, which led to a Meet Me in St. Louis video, which led to the A&E biography, which led to CDs, all of these things. And as my resume got longer and people saw that I had legitimate credits, I wasn't being hired, as I often was, as kind of, background fact checker. They kept boosting me up the credit ladder because they knew I could advise on so many different levels, whom to interview, what they should be asked. Eventually I got to ask the questions myself. I was also hired in the 90s to do a home video documentary called We're Off to See the Munchkins, because I'd been appearing with them for 4 years at the festivals at that point, and they had gotten to trust me. Margaret Pellegrini, one of the dancing Munchkins, said, John Fricke, we trust John Fricke. He knows our best stories. He knows which questions to ask us. This howdy-doody, Opie of Mayberry, Richie Cunningham demeanor of mine back in the day opened a lot of doors, because they also knew that I was very genuinely enthusiastic, and they found out that I was to be trusted, not only in my information, but that blew the doors off archives and files and things that had been buried away and not dusted, so that I had access to a lot of things that other people had not seen or would not have known to look for.
What troubles do a lot of these Judy biographies run into, and why has it sometimes been difficult to get a proper examination of Judy's life?
Well, I think there are a couple answers for that. The major one, because the major biographies about her, there've been, 25 books maybe about Judy Garland, if not more. The major biographies, since they all started blooming in 1975, were written between the early 70s and the early 2000s, when many of the people in her life who were responsible for things that went on in her life and career, these gentlemen were still alive. And whether we're talking husbands, managers, agents, whatever, you could not, even if you discovered it in your research, you could not put it into the books about her, because these men were alive and litigious, or could be litigious. And again, it would have taken more research and more time than even the most scrutinizing of authors would have had time to do, and to try to get the real story and the real background was impossible, let alone to get it, never mind print it. Um, Freddie Fields and David Beagleman, her agents in the 60s, Sid Luft, her manager and husband from the early 50s on and off into the late 60s. Again, there were money issues and marital issues with the later husbands and the later boyfriends. I mean, we can get specific about that as we go, but you couldn't write about those things in those days. It was you couldn't say, for example, that somebody was gay or somebody was a crook, um, even though it was obvious that they might be. And so all these books are totally lopsided in the sense that they can say, well, Judy Garland did this, and then she did that, and then she did that. But if what she's doing is unattractive or irrational, they never put any explanation in, because they couldn't put, why is Judy irrational? Why is she so frustrated? Why doesn't she have any money? Why is she overworked? Why is she unhappy in her marriage to men who were not necessarily equipped to be husbands all the time? I'm not saying that any of these gentlemen, the five husbands, and some of the long-term relationships she had, they loved her, these gentlemen. I'm convinced of that. The couple that I met of the five. Um, but again, it was a crazy situation where you could not tell the truth. And nobody has written a book about Judy Garland in the last decade or so where the truth, where now that all the gentlemen have passed, you could tell the truth that Mark Herron and Mickey Deans and Tom Green were probably bisexual, that Vincent Minnelli was probably bisexual, that Sid Luft gambled away a lot of her money, didn't pay the taxes, that Freddie Fields and David Beagleman embezzled, or that David Beagleman especially embezzled. I don't know if Freddie was even aware of it, but David did. Not doing a plug here because all the books I've written are out of print. But the last one I did, Judy, A Legendary Film Career, that book starts with like a 30-page illustrated biography of Judy. And it came out in 2011 when, as I said earlier, everybody was dead. And the biography is very concise. It's got to be to get her life into a few thousand words. But I can finally point the finger at the gentleman and the problems and where they arose and what she was like when she was able to be healthy, how often she tried to be healthy, how she would, go into a psychiatric nursing home or clinic. They didn't have the Betty Ford Center. They didn't have glamour places to do rehab. You had to go in under cover of darkness and just, oh, Miss Garland is needed a rest. Miss Garland had an emotional upset. Never the truth, because the truth wasn't publishable back then. And again, you hear the friend of Dorothy, the gay icon, the this, the all of her fans love to suffer with her, and they relate to her sorrow, and the hell we do. She was the greatest conduit to joy I could imagine all my life from the time I was 5 on. And I guess in the work, I've tried to kick that across and tried to kick across whatever perspective I could that has come along in the research and the knowing Sid Luft and meeting Mickey Deans and seeing some tax papers and all this kind of, it's just, she could not be more venerated, but she warrants a lot more perspective than she often gets.
It's been said that Judy's mother didn't actually want her, that
she wanted a boy, and that's why she was named Frances. I've read things that said Judy's mother went as far as purposely trying to have a miscarriage while she was pregnant with her. How true are these claims, and how did that affect Judy as a person?
Judy was the third of three daughters to Frank and Ethel Gum, small-time vaudevillians in Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And Ethel had married Frank even though he had a questionable past. They were almost engaged, and then he disappeared for a year, all the way out to Oregon. And he had earlier disappeared from a couple of small towns in Tennessee and elsewhere where he had been working. He just, left town hastily, let's say. But he came back to Superior, Wisconsin, where he had worked with Ethel, and they married and moved to Grand Rapids eventually and managed the silent movie theater there. They had a baby in 1917 and another baby in 1919. And when Ethel became pregnant a third time, there was much concern. They felt they couldn't afford another child. They felt that it wasn't wise. And there were also undercurrents because by this point, Ethel had come to realize that Frank, her husband, was bisexual. And there were indiscretions with local gentlemen, perhaps. Anyway, she was aware that things were not what they had been in her marriage. And she did not want another child on that basis, too. That was all part of it. And this was later told by Ethel to Mark Rabwin and his wife Marcella. Mark was a med student they met in Minnesota during these early years, who then became a renowned physician in Southern California. The girl he married in Southern California was David O. Selznick's executive assistant at Selznick Pictures and very, very much on top of the entertainment field in the 30s and 40s. And they stayed close to the Rabwins, the Gums and Rabwins, all their lives. But Frank and Ethel went to Mark in his dorm room in Minneapolis. They drove I don't know how many hours it took. It's 3 hours plus now to get from Grand Rapids to Minneapolis. But they drove down in a snowstorm to ask him if there was a way he could advise them about an abortion. And this, of course, was as illegal as it could be and dangerous as it could be. And he talked them out of it. In later years, Ethel is the one who told Marcella, his wife, about her being aware of Frank's indiscretions and, that this was all part of it. But it's true, she did, even obviously before they went to see Mark in the first 3 months of the pregnancy, the family joke was, except they weren't joking, is that she would kind of roll herself down staircases and jump off of tables and ride over rough roads in a horse and buggy or in a car this is not a discreet way of saying this, but it was Judy's phrase. Anything she could do to dislodge me. And Judy said it with great humor because she could turn anything into humor. But when she found this out later, that she wasn't wanted, and I don't know how old she was when that happened, but from Judy's late teens until Ethel died when Judy had just turned 30, there was all of this growing animosity and finally a complete split between them. For a number of reasons. But Judy was aware and that she was not wanted. And given everything else that went on in her life, the fact that when the Gums left Grand Rapids when Judy was 4 and moved to California, eventually settling in Lancaster just before Judy turned 5, where her father again ran a theater and the girls sang. Ethel played piano and accompanied. It was the same story as Grand Rapids, but even more so. Eventually, Frank started to lose control, self-control, and things were happening. There wasn't much knowledge of this in the town, but there was some. And this is when Ethel started driving the 3 hours from Lancaster into Los Angeles to get jobs for the girls so they could audition for vaudeville, so they could do theatrical training, all of this kind of stuff. Some of it was to separate the girls from hearing anything, possibly. Some of it was to separate herself from Frank. Judy, as a little girl, Judy was, 5, 6 years old, 7 years old when all this started. She didn't understand it. She knew she loved her father. She knew her mother was very kind of her mother was not an affectionate woman, was not a hands-on, arms around hug kind of woman. It was all business, brusque. We've got to go. And Ethel was protecting herself at this point too, but she was not warm, and this took its toll on her relationship with Judy as well. So that Judy always blamed the failure of the marriage on her mother. When she later heard stories, and her mother told her once, "Well, your father was gay or homosexual or whatever word she used." There was a sense of Judy said, "Well, I think my mother just did that to alibi her own affair because Ethel was having a extramarital affair with a local man in Lancaster too." I mean, it's every soap opera you've ever heard of. Um, but the um, the bottom line is that it was a rough marriage. Things that Judy didn't understand as a little girl, that her parents died before she could understand them. Frank died 6 weeks after Judy signed her MGM contract. She was 13, at the worst possible time to lose the man who was the center of her life. He died of meningitis at a time when there were not drugs that could have handled that. Uh, the family had reunited at that point. One of Judy's older sisters was married, the another one was engaged. But Frank and Ethel and Judy were living together at that point. And I think Virginia, the second oldest daughter, was with them too then. But it was one problem after another. Now, meanwhile, from as early as 1930-31, when Judy would have been 8, 9 years old, and the girls were getting, the Gum sisters were getting increasingly booked in small time vaudeville. Yes, it was small time, and it was just Southern California and around there, but they were also on local radio. They were in demand. They weren't just the kids in Lancaster who made good and sang loud in Judy's case. They were working a lot. And it was at that point that Ethel, according to somebody who knew the Gums from the 20s onward, Ethel said, conversationally, not surreptitiously, not guiltily, because there was nothing to be guilty about. She said, "I've got to keep those girls perky for the shows." They're doing 4 or 5 shows a day between movies. That's how vaudeville worked in the early 30s. And she was giving them some kind of over-the-counter medication that was used, I believe, to treat asthma or something. It was something that had caffeine in it. So it also, perked you up. And if necessary, she was giving the girls these pills so they could go out and sparkle. I don't think she was giving them to them every show or even every day, but there was this process of looking to medicine or medication to help you through, as aspirin did, as medication did in general. It was always there. It was becoming more and more dangerous. Now, Ethel was not putting Judy on amphetamines and barbiturates because they didn't come in until later in the decade. And even when they did, they were miracle drugs. This is wonderful. Benzodrine cuts your appetite, Judy. You can, you won't be as hungry as you are because we can't let you eat as much as you would want to. Judy Garland was 4 feet 11 inches tall. That's as big as she ever is, height-wise, as tall as she ever got. Judy had great natural energy. I mean, she was like everybody who knew her as a kid. She'd shoot herself out of the cannon and away she'd go. She was lively and very, very, very intelligent. The first time the family knew she could sing was when she was a year and a half old. And she had a little playmate over, and her father sat down at the piano and taught them to sing America, My Country, 'Tis of Thee. And Judy learned it like twice through. She could sing it by heart. She had that kind, and this was true to her entire life. You could play a new song for her. She'd sing it back to you. Hugh Martin, who wrote the songs for Meet Me in St. Louis, trolley song, Boy Next Door, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas. He said it was spooky. He said we'd play her a new song and she'd sing it right back to you. And she'd have the music in front of her, but she couldn't read notes. She could see if they went up and down, but this was all in her brain. It's the same thing with dance steps. You'd show her a dance and she'd know it and she'd do it. Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire were dumbfounded by this, because they said she wasn't, you wouldn't class her with Sid Charisse and Leslie Caron and Vera Ellen and people like that. She was not a born dancer. Sid Charisse, Vera Ellen, and Leslie Caron all had to have their songs dubbed in their movies, by the way. Judy didn't. But Judy could hoof as Gene. She was a great hoofer. And she could do something with so much style that you would think she was a brilliant dancer.
Conversely, I want to talk about her relationship with her father, what that was like, his death, how that affected her, and how it affected her relationship with her mother going forward.
By all accounts, Frank Gum was his own kind of charismatic human being. He was outgoing and warm and a great singer, for small time vaudeville anyway. And he just embraced everybody and loved everybody and was the guy who worked on the town paper and sang in the choir and all of that kind of stuff. He spread himself out. And Judy loved him. She adored him. She was the baby, obviously. The two older sisters were into lives of their own by the time Judy came along, being 5 and 7 years older than she was. And so it was the relationship that meant the most to her. And especially as she got past like age 6, 7, 8, and she was being taken away all the time. They all three were. But, Judy wanted to stay home and play with her friends. She was, second, third, fourth grade. She loved to sing, but she didn't necessarily like the auditioning and the people who, didn't pay attention or didn't react. But her father always reacted. He was the one who sang to her before she went to bed at night. The one who was just the center of her family world. She got along with her sisters. She loved her mother without much tangible reciprocation. I'm not saying Ethel didn't love her kids. I'm just saying that Ethel's mind was always 100 places, and sometimes family was not one of them. But Frank was the center of Judy's personal life. And by the time she got to MGM, he had taken her she had 3 MGM auditions, and it was the third one that did the trick. And Frank took her to that one. Ethel was busy doing a rehearsal for a show somewhere else, and the call came through, and Frank's the one who was there when MGM finally decided that we will take Judy Garland. And he was thrilled. He heard her first national radio broadcast about 3 weeks later. And but then this inner ear problem that he'd always had kicked in and developed into meningitis a few weeks after that. And he was in the hospital the night she did her second national radio broadcast. This has been dramatized and discussed, but Dr. Rabwin, Mark Rabwin, who was the family doctor and who had been friends with Ethel and Frank since Grand Rapids in the early 20s, called the radio station and told Judy that a radio was put beside her father's bedside in the hospital so he could hear her. But evidently he was already in a coma without the kind of drugs that could cure meningitis now. And whether or not he heard her is a moot point. But as she said, I sang my heart out for him, but by morning he was gone. And he did indeed die the next day. Years later, Liza Minnelli, Judy's oldest daughter, asked, "How did you feel, Mama? What was that like?" Liza came of age being able to really talk to her mom when they could communicate, and that was one of the things that she asked. And Judy's quote was, "How did you feel, Mama?" And Judy said, "I felt that now nobody is on my side." And Frank was indeed the buffer between Ethel's ambition and the girls, especially seeing as he and Ethel were back together and that they were living together again. And Frank saw, how much Judy was being dragged to this movie studio and that studio during this time period. And they all liked her, but they didn't have anything for her. The standard line was, "What do we do with a 13-year-old girl who sings like a 30-year-old woman?" So it was the fact that MGM did take her was a cause of great celebration. And everybody was very happy because this is what they had been kind of working for. And Frank wasn't there to enjoy it. And I don't think Ethel was very good at helping the girls remember Frank or remember Frank fondly. And Judy soon was the only one at home still. I know that it distressed Judy enormously when the man with whom Ethel had been carrying on, Bill Gilmore, while Frank was still alive even, she announced to her daughters that she was going to marry him on the 4th anniversary of Frank's passing. And that was also happened to be Ethel's birthday. So she wasn't, really putting the knife in. She, wanted to make it special for herself. None of the girls liked Bill Gilmore. As it turned out, even Ethel didn't like Bill Gilmore. She tried to back out of the marriage at the last minute, and he pretended he didn't understand, and they got married. But it was just the one constant at home when Judy was home to whom she could turn. Somebody who would put his arms around her, somebody who would hug her, somebody would tell her that she was pretty, even though Judy had heard her mother say to people at the studio auditions who were impressed with Judy's voice, but said, "Why isn't this girl in the movies?" And Judy would hear Ethel say, "I think it's because she's not pretty enough," which is rough for a little girl of 10, 11, 12 to hear. And of course, when Judy was signed by MGM, Ethel bought into their, she's got to eat less, help her diet, watch her weight. And Judy was just burning energy a mile a minute, not because of being on pills at that point. They were coming, obviously, but because she was doing something she loved. She loved to sing, and she loved being at Metro, being around the stars and singing at the stars' parties, and finding out that the stars were just as excited about her talent as she was about theirs. But it was a long haul. When your father dies when you're 13, at a very challenging age for any human being, and when you've just signed a studio contract with MGM, a position you had been working for years at your mother's insistence and everybody's encouragement because of your talent, and when you don't feel you're attractive to anybody except maybe your dad, and then he's gone, and he's the one who's been defending you and protecting you and saying, "Don't make her work so hard," or whatever all the stories are. Those are all parts of the puzzle, and they all have to be put into the greater mosaic of Judy Garland's life. And how did they affect? And I can't imagine that those things, I don't know who you'd have to be to not be affected by all those things.
I want to talk about MGM. Of course, MGM has been villainized a lot, and some things are true, some things are not. And I guess we should start with the most infamous topic, the pills. There's this notion that Judy was being maliciously drugged up while being tied down to a chair or something. What's the actual context of Judy being given these pills?
The actual context of the pills at MGM, and again, Ethel had been perking the girls up with caffeine related pills occasionally already. Um, it was nothing malicious. It was nothing horrific. It was nothing force fed on her. She had a healthy appetite. There were people in her family who were very much overweight. It was just, family one of the family gene problems, along with suicide and alcohol and substance abuse and other things as it turned out. But the idea was, this will kill her appetite. Take a Benzedrine. This is the new miracle drug. They weren't trying to pep her up. They were trying to curb her appetite. The peppiness came with the medication. It was a side effect. Ultimately, many, many, many people were taking it for the lift, for the speed. But that wasn't the initial problem or the initial stipulation. Then she would again have to, she was a night person. She'd grown up in vaudeville where you slept in the morning and then you did your first show at noon and you did your last show at 9, and then you had dinner and you didn't go to bed till 1 or 2. Well, you had to go to bed at 8 or 9 if you had to be up at 5 or 6 to be at the studio. It just was a shift at a time when she had a certain pattern ingrained in her life. So these were all things that played into it. Now, granted, I don't know when one pill became two and when Seconal or a sleeping pill was needed to offset the benzodrine. I don't think it was very long into her stay at Metro, but it certainly was not a force-fed situation of multiple pills a day when she was still in her mid-teens during the first Andy Hardy pictures, the pictures, early pictures with Mickey, and certainly not during The Wizard of Oz. People, 80 pill, 80 cigarettes, black coffee, and pills. If you look at her in The Wizard of Oz, she is probably more thick around the middle than she is at any of her other early pictures. She's a little chunky in the one just before, Listen, Darling, but she is not plump. She's not chubby. She's just thick-waisted. When you are 4'11" and you have a singer's build, she had the lung power and an enormous rib cage that started just below her bosom, and then very, very long legs. So it all went to her middle when she did eat and when she did put on weight. But again, even during these, Judy, you're too fat. You look like a hunchback. You this, that, the other thing. Where do you see it? Where is it? And certainly not in The Wizard of Oz. Is this some kind of shaking, caffeinated, coffee drinking, pill popping wraith of a human being? I mean, she looks healthy as can be and is built healthily. Now, part of the problem, the pills really escalated 2 years later in 1940 when Judy turned 18. One of the long range problems in Wizard of Oz, and one of many reasons it took 6 months to film, is that Judy was 16 years old throughout the filming. She was a minor. This meant that by law, she could only work on a film 4 hours a day. And this was scrupulously monitored. 4 hours a day was it. 3 hours a day had to be in school, an hour for recreation. I don't know what that constituted at MGM, but who knows? The bottom line is that was what the laws were for child performers in the movies. Now, MGM got around this. They would send the makeup and the hair people to Judy's house at like 6 a.m. so that she could be made up and hairdressed and everything, so that when she drove through the gate at 8 or 8:30, she could be put right to work on the film, slip into her costume and rehearse and go right into the movie. And then the schooling would take place at odd moments in between takes and in between resetting the camera, or going for a different angle or changing the lighting. Technicolor was comparatively new. It took lots of lights. It took lots of adjustment of a huge camera. And so they'd say, okay, they'd have Judy's stand-in go through the paces, testing the wind machines, hit your mark on the yellow brick road. All right, this is where we will light Judy. This is where she should stop. And they'd have the stand-in do this several times while Judy would be in a tent off at the side of the soundstage with her tutor. And this comes courtesy Karen Marshall, Judy's second stand-in for Wizard of Oz. And Karen, when Bobby Cochet, who was Judy's regular stand-in, was otherwise occupied, Karen would test the wind machines and stand on the yellow brick road and this sort of thing. And she said that it was just amazing. She would work against these wind machines, she said, and they blew hard. And the stuff flying left and right, and get through the house and go out and stomp on the cellar door. And Judy watched me do all of this once, and then she'd come in and do it perfectly. But again, Judy was under the legal restrictions of a 16-year-old. When she turned 18 on June 10th, 1940, she was just finishing Andy Hardy Meets Debutante and going into Strike Up the Band. Well, that's when they could work her as an adult. And that's when, as Judy said later, she thought that Busby Berkeley, the director on the big musical she did with Mickey, she said, I thought he did a wonderful job on the early pictures. But Buzz meant all those days of benzodrine and working as hard as we did to get the films done. And, when she was being worked 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours. And everybody knows this. Robert Stack, great actor who was a few years older than Judy, but became a friend of hers when she was like 13. and became really good friends. And he talks about Judy Garland and starts to tear up because he thought so highly of her. And when I interviewed him, he said they just worked those kids, Judy and Mickey, into the ground. And maybe Mickey could handle it more. Mickey was maybe more manic. But Mickey runs hot and cold, or ran hot and cold about stories about MGM. Sometimes, oh no, they never gave her pills, and sometimes, oh, there was always a doctor there. You don't. Mickey's mind didn't track, and I know this by dint of having interviewed him and worked with him a couple times. And this was starting as early as the 1970s. His memory was questionable. Great, brilliant talent. I'm not maligning Mickey Rooney. I'm just saying you cannot take as scripture everything he said. So that was all part of the problem. And I think the actual really heavy duty pill use, 2 instead of 1, or maybe 1 several times a day, started during those musicals. All those rehearsals, all of those songs to be learned, all of those dances and lines. And because she and Mickey just, once they did a scene, they rehearsed a scene, then they nailed it. They could do it like that. But Berkeley wanted take after take after take of the musical numbers. A couple of the contract dancers at Metro told me that he was just a real jerk when it came to overworking and over rehearsing, and especially with Judy and Mickey, who didn't need it. As I say, she could come in and learn a song and learn a dance and do it, and boom, it was done. And again, it was 1940 and 41 and into 42 when she was making 3 pictures a year. And she was a regular on the Bob Hope radio show in 1939 to 1940. She was doing a lot of other radio after that. She was doing recording sessions for Decca. She started in 1941 going to army camps. And when the war picked up, there was more of that. And it was movie after movie and song after song and new song for radio after new song for radio and sketches. And at 4'11" and a camera thin 95 pounds or 100 pounds at the outside, this was just more than she could take, her nervous system. And one of Judy Garland's great natural qualities, and everybody knows this, was her vulnerability. She was so open and embraced everybody. She was nice to everybody. She wanted everybody to be nice to her. She wanted everybody to like her. And she poured that forth. And she did not have that shield of retaining some of that for herself. She just thought, give it out. Give it to everybody. I love them and I want them to love me. When she was doing her TV series and CBS called her on the carpet saying, don't touch your guests. We're getting complaints from the viewers. Why are you always touching your guests? She wasn't molesting them. She'd hold their hand. She'd, they said, well, we're getting comments. And Judy said, I'm a woman who wants to take 140 million people in her arms. She loved who she was and she loved what she did. But the pressures, she had her first nervous breakdown in early 1943. And she had done in the preceding, since Wizard of Oz, she'd done Babes in Arms, 2 Andy Hardys, Little Nellie Kelly, Ziegfeld Girl, Babes on Broadway, Strike Up the Band, For Me and My Gal, Presenting Lily Myers, and now she was starting Girl Crazy, back with Buzz Berkeley again, and the overwork, and she caved in. She's rail thin in the I Got Rhythm number, which is the first thing Buzz Berkeley filmed. Take after take, a longing, Nancy Walker, the comedian, was on the lot at that time too. She has a bit in Girl Crazy, a nice little supporting part, and she was also in Best Foot Forward, the show she'd done on Broadway, and she'd come to Metro to do. And so she would see Judy and say, well, what are you working on now? And Judy say, I Got Rhythm. And Nancy said, haven't you finished that yet? And Judy said, no, we've only done 40 choruses. All of that snowballed at MGM across the 40s. The first nervous breakdown, as I said, during Girl Crazy. And Mark Rablin came in and said, this girl needs 8 weeks off. You've got to give her time off. She has done all of this work back to back, and she is a shaking wreck. there's a memo that I reprint in one of the Garland books I did about Judy's health situation at that point, and talks about the doctor's recommendation. And then it goes on to say, but we've spoken to Judy's mother, and she says with the right rest and nutrition, Judy can be back at work in 3 weeks. So again, it was like there's guilty behavior, legitimate guilty behavior on the part of the studio, on the part of her mother, on the part of all kinds of people. But having known 20 of the Munchkins personally, I can guarantee that they never molested her. Again, this is taken out of context from a later Jack Paar program, where she talks about the fact that they were drunks, and indeed there were some who party. She was medicated on this Jack Paar show, and she's very funny and wicked. And she talks about one of the gentlemen, one of the midgets, asking her out, he was about 40, and she said, I didn't want to go out with him. And I said, oh, my mother won't let me. Fine. And she said they were drunks and they'd get smashed every night, and MGM would pick them up in butterfly nets. And the studio audience, of course, is going crazy. But was she being vindictive? Was she being mean? Was she exaggerating to a point? Well, Jack Paar later on went to tell the story on TV about all these midgets would put their hands up their dress, and Sid Luft, in his autobiography, which took 4 ghostwriters and wasn't even printable till after he died with another ghostwriter, all of that gets exaggerated. And oh no, it was just short of molestation, or just on the other side of it's again, dirty talk in dirty times is what we're dealing with. And because the Munchkins who survived, they were teens when this happened, so they weren't partying, but they certainly knew about the ones who were, and about the stuff that was going on. But to a person, they remembered Judy with great fondness, and how, yes, she was being called to as soon as they were done with the scene, she'd be called to school, so they didn't have a whole lot of time together, but that she did come out, and if she managed to get school done and she was still filming, she'd sit on the Yellow Brick Road and talk with them, and she gave them a Christmas present. All of them loved her. She probably talked to Margaret Hamilton most, because Margaret Hamilton had been a school teacher, and Judy, they found a bond. It was girl talk.
Are you going?
Musical.
You have to go right now.
Very soon.
Have you got your broom with you?
No, I don't. We're going to use a New York broom called the Bus.
Oh, darling. Well, now, what is the show?
Well, the show is Come Summer, and it's starring our old friend Ray Bolger.
Oh, what's he doing away?
Well, he's doing a lovely New England character in it.
Oh, my goodness. Well, I missed you.
Well, I've missed
You're my
you
favorite
for so
witch.
long.
My goodness.
I better be.
Well, I think you're everybody's favorite lady.
Well, it's lovely to see you, dear.
Well, come
Just
back.
wonderful.
Come
I
back.
hope I can come
Yes,
back.
indeed.
Take care.
I will indeed.
Lovely to see you, and thank you for letting me
Laugh,
come
just
see
do
you.
that wicked me laugh. Bye. Give Ray my love.
I will.
Bye, love.
Eventually, MGM paid for Judy to see a therapist later in the 40s, when she got, had married a second time. She'd had 2 abortions. She was still overworked. She was on medication. Everything was wrong in terms of the director they assigned her, the husband to whom she was married. And I'm not saying that she's saying that these things were wrong. She recognized they were wrong. But the studio knew it too, and they just barreled ahead and said, we know what we're doing, do what we tell you. There was a lot of that. And very little acknowledgement of how important she was to them. Yes, she was getting great properties and great assignments, but she couldn't take that kind of pressure anymore, the kind of pounding. And the studio was always more than likely, if Judy had to be taken out of the picture, to put the blame on Judy, as opposed to what they'd been doing to Judy that put Judy in that condition in the first place. Even in 1949 and 1950, you'll hear anonymous workers, dancers and people like that, being interviewed in the LA press about, this isn't Judy's fault. Judy's great. We've been working with her on movies for years, and this is not her fault. And they would explain why. You know, the overwork, the wrong director, the wrong treatment. It again, all kinds of blame can be given. And did Judy Garland have an addictive personality? Yes. And did she come to crave that kind of medication? Yes. She had a physical dependency on it, and she had an emotional dependency on it, and she had came to have the great dependency on it, not strictly benzodrine and dexedrine and sleeping pills to live, but to do the work that she knew was expected of her. And again, her sensitivity, her vulnerability, all of that stuff. A lot of movie stars could take it. She couldn't. And what made her special was what was working against her. You know, how many MGM movie stars of the 30s and 40s are talked about to this day or known?
It's been widely discussed how MGM played a huge role in Judy's insecurities, particularly about her physical appearance. So, what was the true extent of MGM's scrutiny over her looks, and how far did their comments about her appearance go?
Part of Judy's insecurity was the harping that MGM did, especially in the early years, on her physical appearance. You know, it wasn't just the weight. You think of Anne Rutherford, Mickey Rooney's girlfriend in the Andy Hardy movies, Lana Turner, Katherine Grayson, Esther Williams, who were the other girls who were thrown into Andy Hardy's life, always with Judy, you know, playing the other girl. That Judy was just presented as kind of this normal kid with no glam. Again, Roger Edens, who wrote her life in effect in his special material for her, it went in her first Andy Hardy film when, you know, she's playing 12, 13, although she's really 16. And Andy is too busy thinking about Lana Turner and Anne Rutherford to pay her any attention, and refers to her as a child. And he leaves her, and she's despondent. She says, "No glamour. That's my problem. No glamour at all." And she sings a song called "I'm Just an In Between," meaning I'm between little girl and debutante. And that's how she was made to feel on camera and off camera. I mean, it's almost insidious. And Metro has to take some of the responsibility for this, because she did Pigskin Parade at Fox on loan out from Metro. She did Broadway Melody singing Dear Mr. Gable. She did Thoroughbreds Don't Cry, a racing movie with Mickey Rooney as a jockey. She did Everybody Sing, which was like her fourth feature film. And it was basically built around her character, the young swing singing teen of a show business family. Billie Burke, who played Glinda in The Wizard of Oz, this was before Wizard, played her mother. She had an older, pretty sister, a father who was a playwright. But the working script that they handed Judy, this script that was written for her, was called, and I quote, "The Ugly Duckling." And at least twice, if not three times in the script, Billie Burke refers to her either as mother's dear little ugly duckling, or she says to her two daughters, "You're looking very pretty today, even Judy." And the kid has to react, you know, facially as if, "Geez, mom," you know. But what is that doing to the girl playing the girl? You know, that this is how she's been cast. Now, they eventually changed the title of the movie to Swing Fever and then to Everybody Sing, but they sure weren't doing her any favors in presenting her that way. Same thing in Love Finds Sandy Hardy. Again, playing young, playing 12, 13. Judge Hardy says she's that old. Listen, Darling, the fill-in picture she did because The Wizard of Oz wasn't ready. She's graduating from junior high in that film. So what does that make her, 14? 15 at the outside. And then Babes in Arms, luckily, and she and Mickey both got to play high school teenagers. And they're letting her be prettier, even though there's always a blonde, in this case, June Preiser, who is walking off with Mickey until the end of the film. And she went through this in several more films. So they, in addition to harping on her weight and harping on the shape of her nose, there's a famous scene in A Star Is Born where James Mason has gotten Judy her screen test, and they've made her a blonde, and they've gunked her face up with 10 pounds of makeup. and they put a bridge on her nose because it was decided at MGM that her nose dipped in too much. So they actually had given her this piece of plastic that is on her, adheres to her nose. And they did this again to her in Stars when they were making her up, and James Mason peels it off. Now, at MGM, eventually, after the first 3 or 4 films, they stopped doing this to her. But there were discs that for a while they put in her nostrils to make them flare more. Just dowdy clothes and dowdy hairstyles, and all of this was all part of her persona in those early films until she opened her mouth, and then nobody could touch her when she sang. And this kept on, though, because again, it was the harping about the weight and work harder, Judy. And as we've done the litany of how many movies she made between 1939 and 1943, and the nervous breakdown, and her going into therapy, and Louis B. Mayer finding out she was seeing a therapist, and MGM's great producer, director, writer Joe Mankiewicz got fired because he's the one who led Judy to a therapist, because Judy was very conflated about her mother and her father and all of these issues. She was then, 19, 20 years old. And Mayer called Mankiewicz in. Ethel Gilmore was sitting there, and Mayer saying, you know, this girl needs a mother's love and discipline from her mother. And Ethel says, this girl is spoiled. She needs to be locked in a closet. And Mankiewicz is hearing all this and not believing what he's hearing. And Mankiewicz, with a great touch of humor that Judy herself would have had, listens to all of this tirade from his boss and Judy's mom. After Mayer finally stopped talking, Joe Mankiewicz looked at Louis B. Mayer and said, well, Mr. Mayer, it's obvious that this studio is not big enough for both of us. One of us has to go. And one of the Mayer's adjuncts cracked up, got a dirty glare from Mayer. Ethel was appalled. But Joe Mankiewicz left MGM that day. And as Christopher Finch, one of the better Garland biographers, put it, all the Oscars Joe Mankiewicz won from then on, he won for other studios. But again, by the time of the collapses of Barclays of Broadway, 48, Annie Get Your Gun, 49, by that point, MGM encouraged her into therapy and, you know, tried to help. It was just too little too late. And of course you can go to therapy, Judy, but don't forget, you've got to still be here at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And Judy said, one of the quotes from one of her autobiographical magazine articles in the early 60s, she says, imagine getting up at 6, lying on a psychiatrist's couch and talking for an hour to a man whose accent I couldn't understand, and then going to MGM and making love to Mickey Rooney on screen, and then going back to the therapist for another hour at the end of the day. She said, no wonder I cracked up. And she was not always honest with her therapists. You know, she said, Liza tells the story that she said, what did you talk about, Mama? And Judy said, well, he always looked so bored. So I made up stories to just, you know, try to entertain him. And again, I think part of that was true, but I think also it was the defense. How do you talk about homosexuality in your family when it is so scorned and so looked upon as mental illness? And if indeed she did want to talk about that, and I'm sure she did, she was too vulnerable and too insecure not to talk about it. And the trouble with her mom and the pressure from her mom, which was only increased, you know, it's true, you know, in the early days, Ethel would say, you behave, Judy, or I'll tell Mr. Mayer on you. So Judy was living in constant 24/7 terror of displeasing her mother at home, displeasing the studio. That all adds up. And she didn't have what it took to withstand it, not given the first 13 years of her life. Judy, you know, would later say, psychiatry was like taking a cure for a disease I didn't have, which again was her blocking out what she couldn't face, or again, the wrong therapists for her. They were the best, but you know, their reputation continues to this day, but they were bad for George Gershwin. They were bad for any number of celebrities who saw them in the 30s and 40s. again, part of the judgment on judgment at Nuremberg, we talk about, well, judgment at Judy Garland. Part of the problem is that people are now trying to bring the perspective of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s to Judy Garland's problem and Judy Garland's story and the cast of people in Judy Garland's life and the work situations in Judy Garland. And you cannot apply a lot of what has been learned today, or how things are treated today, and how things are more understood today and sympathized with today and treated more intelligently today. Again, well, Benzedrine's a miracle drug. Take two if one isn't helping you. Take two Seconal. Take three. Take four.
It's been said that Judy had a friend she was close with named Betty Asher, and that Betty Asher wound up being essentially a spy for MGM, and that their whole friendship was a lie so that MGM could get information about everything Judy was doing. What can you tell me about that?
MGM, especially in the early 40s, when Judy was in the top 10 box office 2 years in a row, 40 and 41. For her pictures the preceding year, and hit records for Decca and radio. And she was quickly becoming the studio's biggest asset, especially because they still weren't paying her all that much. And her pictures were bringing in millions in profit. But she was breaking out. She had eloped to Las Vegas with David Rose. She had become pregnant with David Rose, but under pressure from the studio and Ethel, and I guess ambivalence from David Rose, to whom the studio and Ethel got and cornered and persuaded him to see things their way. Judy had an abortion, which she did not want to have, which pretty much, as she said, that the marriage was over then. I mean, we were married for another couple of years, but that was the end of the marriage. And so she was dating Joe Mankiewicz, who was married. She was seeing Tyrone Power, who was married. They were separated, but and she was so flattered that somebody as intelligent and masculine as Joe Mankiewicz was paying attention to her. She was so flattered that somebody who was as gorgeous as Tyrone Power, the most beautiful man on the screen in the late 30s, early 40s, also bisexual. There's the attraction, that Judy was seeking. This is way too abrupt a sentence, but apply it generically. Judy seeking people men who reminded her of her father, who had that kind of they were simpatico, for lack of a better word. So, and MGM was wary of this and was bad. Judy got married. The next year, Mickey Rooney went off and married Ava Gardner, and he's still playing Andy Hardy. Judy's still playing Betsy Booth. I mean, well, what audiences are going to, when Judy made Little Nellie Kelly playing a dual role, Nellie Kelly, and then Nellie Kelly's daughter, Little Nellie Kelly. Nellie Kelly, the mother, dies in childbirth. So Judy plays both parts. And Mayer was incensed. We can't let that child have a baby on the screen, was his dictum. Well, they went ahead anyway. But so MGM wanted to keep very, very close tabs. There was a man named Les Peterson who was assigned to Mickey Rooney, but was basically a studio spy. Betty Asher was assigned to Judy as a publicity adjunct and was very palsy with Judy, very down to earth, very gal pally. Judy loved this. Judy could be out get an apartment of her own. She got an apartment with Betty Asher. Judy told Betty Asher everything. Betty Asher knew about Tyrone Power and Joe Mankiewicz. And so did the studio, because who was telling them about Joe and Tyrone but Betty Asher? She was a studio spy. And when Judy heard this, she was devastated. There's a line from a movie, another Judy delivers, Judy Holliday in the solid gold Cadillac, who's conned into taking a job with a big corporation, so she'll keep her mouth shut about the corporation's doings. It's called the Solid Gold Cadillac. It is well worth seeing. It is on TV a lot. But when Judy Holliday finds out about this, they said, well, couldn't you suspect how everybody was so nice? The bosses were all so nice to you and gave you this job and gave you this office. And Judy Holliday says with great poignancy, I'm never suspicious of people who are nice to me. That was Judy Garland's problem, too. Betty Asher later kind of infiltrated herself with a lot of people at MGM and was reporting in on a lot of people. She later died of suicide. I don't think she was a very happy woman. I don't know if she was a lesbian. There are rumors to that effect. There are rumors because she was, and because she and Judy shared an apartment. There are rumors to that effect about Judy. Whether they're true or not, there's absolutely no way of telling, because everybody who knew Judy, and I got to talk to many people who did from the 30s onward, said that, whatever was going on, Judy Garland was basically a very heterosexual woman who was very interested in men and in romance and all that kind of stuff. The standard psychological statement, which is cliche, but there's some truth in it, is that when guys marry, they look for their mothers, and when girls marry, they look for their fathers to a certain extent, characteristics anyway, simpatico things again. And I think that was certainly the case for Judy. She looked for older men. I think, again, she had an advanced sense of romance and being taken care of as her father took care of her. And so she wouldn't have looked to Mickey Rooney necessarily for that. But she developed crushes on older teens. She dated Jackie Cooper. Well, he was actually younger, but she dated Billy Hallup from the Dead End Kids and developed a huge crush on Oscar Levant, the pianist and wit and writer. Again, somebody whose mind captivated her. It was the same thing with Artie Shaw. She certainly had a romantic crush on him, but he was also very philosophical and learned and knowledgeable, or at least he could speak as if he was those things. And I think that was part of it too. But David Rose, her first husband, was, I believe, over 30 when they met. She was 19 when they married. And Joe Mankiewicz was older. Tyrone Power was a little bit older, but and then along came Vincent Minnelli, who was gentle and 19 years older than she was, and effective on the set. He had been helping out behind the scenes on movies as early as Strike Up the Band in 1940. He helped out on Babes on Broadway. Judy later said, flattering him, that I found out, I didn't know who was doing coming up with all these ideas for our films, but I later found out that the things I liked doing the best were things that Vincent Minnelli had contributed. Whether that's true or not, it made a good quote for when they started dating. For once, MGM didn't mind that she was dating somebody older, because he was an MGM employee. That kind of kept it all under the same umbrella. But the thing is, Vincent was also very, was considered effeminate. When he evidently first started at Metro, he had odd dressing patterns, and one of the contract dancers, who was not a woman to gossip, but one of them said to me in the 1980s, you don't marry a man who wears makeup to work. And they felt that, Vincent was making up a little bit to come in, and he's just putting his best foot forward, however you want to look at it. It was a difficult thing. Yet he and Judy hit it off during Meet Me in St. Louis. Then they broke up. She went back to Joe Mankiewicz briefly, and then on the clock, she and Minnelli became serious. And he was an older man. He was indeed at least bisexual, as her father had been. And I think that it all kind of clicked there. Later on, she, or even before, she was dating people like Orson Welles and Yul Brynner, who were masculine and intelligent and creative. And then she would date Van Johnson, who was also bisexual at MGM. Chuck Walters, her director choreographer. They even talked about getting married at one point when Judy was between David Rose and Vincent Minnelli. But Chuck already had a male partner of many years. And again, there was a lot of consideration among these people as to what has to look good, for Hollywood. The fact that there were a lot of what they called lavender marriages, where the husband or the wife or both were gay, and they had married somebody else who was gay so that they could have their separate lives, but appear happily married in Photoplay magazine and Modern Screen magazine and that sort of thing. It was just being done. So all of that contributed to Judy's looking at older men. Sid Luft was an older man, older than he admitted to at the time, but again, not just a few years older or even a decade older, but considerably older than Judy. And that was certainly the roller coaster Hollywood marriage, 2 or 3 separations, 2 or 3 filings for divorce along the way. Sid always, 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 when they were separated, carrying her into court for custody of the kids, for money, always for money, because Sid was a real wheeler dealer, and made the bookings and saw to her that she was the highest paid entertainer in Las Vegas history in 1956, and got the highest pay from CBS for her first TV special, and saw to all of that kind of stuff, did the paperwork on A Star Is Born, but whatever money came in was hers, or she was making it. And if he was hired as a producer, fine. They looked to that too. He wanted that kind of reputation and billing. But all of that money went out. There were no savings. There were no investments. By the end of the 1950s, the taxes weren't being paid. And this meant debts that for which Judy was dunned for the rest of her life. She would say, "Why don't you find Sid Luft? He owes you this money. I never saw any of this money." It was a no-win situation. And when they finally divorced in 1965, to finally get her divorce from him, she had to pay him alimony, which one of the great but she was so anxious to get rid of him so that she could marry Mark Herron, with whom she'd been having an affair for a year or so. But the number of times Sid Luft hauled Judy into court and put her through that. And during the TV series, he was doing everything he could to get to her. And he went into court, and this was banner headlines on the LA papers the next day. 20 suicide attempts by Judy Garland alleged in court. And he said, "Oh, she's done this, she's done that, she's unstable. But the bottom line was, I can't support the kids, but I want them, and I certainly want money from her." It was a mess. But who came out looking bad in all of this but Judy Garland? She was the woman. She was supposed to be Dorothy Gale. "At last I have found love," says Judy Garland. Again, but it was impossible, because the medication dependency would start up if she started to work. She had no day-to-day money. This was true. She had a suit against Freddie Fields and David Beagleman for $3 million for money they embezzled and money they withheld. She joined Sid in a suit he had, because he had tape-recorded proof that they admitted to all of this stuff. And so Judy joined Sid's suit. But then when Judy and Sid got together back in 1967, and he started managing things for her, he put her on this backbreaking concert tour of 80 concerts in 6 months. And again, there was no money at the end of it, and no solution to any of this. It was all so complicated. And one of the things about Judy that is absolutely irrevocably true, she could find these men, as likely or as less likely as they were. And because she loved them, and because they paid attention to her and loved her, she could imbue them with all the characteristics she thought they should have. And then she believed that they had. All this goes back to the fact of her treatment at MGM, her sense of self-worth. Before MGM, "I think she's not in movies," says Judy's mother, "because she's not pretty enough." Frank Gum and Ethel giving her a rocky home life. Ethel trundling her to audition after audition after audition, and vaudeville engagement after engagement. And Judy dealing with agents and movie producers and offices who listened to her, but they didn't show any reaction. She poured herself out, singing like nobody had sung before at ages 10, 11, and 12. And then getting to Metro and being told, "You're not pretty, you're too fat, you have a hunchback, you're too short, you're this, you're that, you're the other thing." So that her self-image, and then having crushes on people who didn't have crushes on her as a teenager, or with whom she broke up because she thought the grass was greener, having husbands who loved her but weren't able to protect her. All of this, added up to one error in judgment on her part after another. But again, always in the water, going down for the third time and reaching for the nearest rowboat. She thought she was reaching for the Queen Mary too, or the Queen Elizabeth too. She was reaching for the Titanic in every case, on one level or another. They couldn't, these men were not capable of helping her the way she wanted them to. Even Minnelli, and the point I want to make about him is that Hugh Martin, who wrote, as we said, the songs for Meet Me in St. Louis, early on in Hugh's career at MGM, which would have been 1942, and Minnelli had just been learning the ropes. He hadn't directed a film then as yet. But they were talking about, who Hugh said, which talent at MGM do you think has the greatest future, has the greatest ability? And he said, I think the little Garland girl, was Minnelli's response. And Minnelli was very quick then to ingratiate himself with her. I'm not saying he had some kind of master plan in mind, but I think he realized that it would not hurt to work with Judy Garland. It would not hurt to date Judy Garland. It would not hurt to marry Judy Garland, because then he would be one of those husbands who could be with Judy Garland in the movie magazines, and any suspicions about him would be allayed. Also, when we did the 1997 A&E biography special about Judy, I co-wrote and co-produced that, and I got to choose a lot of the people we interviewed, and they were 90% of them, 92% of them, could not wait to talk about Judy Garland, and great people. And one of them was June Allison, Judy's gal pal from 1942-43 through the rest of her life. And they weren't close 24/7, but they were close much of the time. And June, we were interviewing her at her home in Ojai, California. When we started talking and I started asking questions, and this was an advantage in these documentaries, anytime I was doing an interview, I knew which questions to ask these people, because I'd had my basic training for 40 years at that point in Judy Garland. And so June, Ann Miller, Bob Stack, when I started asking what I asked, you could see it registering, not, oh God, what have I gotten myself into? But just this kind of sense of, oh, this guy knows what he's talking about. I better tell the truth. And they did. And so after we'd been talking for about 20 minutes, June said to me, or I said, we'd gotten through the early days at Metro and how she and Judy first met. And I said, now, I asked this of several MGM people, and I phrased it as delicately and politely as I could. This was 1996. And I said, now, there are some people who say that Vincent Minnelli, whom Judy married, was not the most likely candidate for marriage. And I think that was very polite and very tactful. I got pretty much the answer I expected to that question, and not in great graphic detail, but June said it best. She looked at me very closely while I was asking that question, and she paused, and then she looked at me again, and she said very simply and very simply, it was no question it couldn't work out. He was wrong for Judy, completely wrong. And we used that quote in the documentary. Despite the fact that they were married for 5 years, they had Liza, there were many happy moments. He directed one of her 4 greatest films, Meet Me in St. Louis, when they were still courting. But I went on to ask June, well, isn't there anybody who would have or could have said something to Judy? Again, I myself guilty of bringing 1990s sensibility to a 1940s situation. But they were all in show business, and gay people in Hollywood or Broadway or anywhere were not a secret. And I said, well, isn't there anybody who could have said anything to her or would have said anything to her? And June just kind of shook her head and looked so, can't find the word for how she looked, but there was this expression on her face of, no, we couldn't, because and then what she said was, we all saw how happy Judy was. The implication being that all these people who loved her had wanted her to be happy for so long and knew how much she gave of herself personally, professionally, family, all of it. And they thought it was like, if Vincent Minnelli is going to make her happy, then she should marry Vincent Minnelli. I asked Ann Miller, the tap dancer who worked with Judy at MGM, the same question I asked June Allison. And Ann said, "Oh, honey, I don't know anything about that." And I thought, okay, she doesn't want to go there. We moved on. About 10 minutes later, we were reloading the camera, more film. And she said, "Well, honey, I couldn't say anything on camera because God knows Liza's a friend of mine. And Lee Anderson Minnelli, Vincent's last wife, is a friend of mine." But she said, "Vincent Minnelli, you had to close the window or he'd fly right out." Gerald Frank, when he interviewed everybody in 1975, had the chance to ask the questions, but then he couldn't put anything in his book. His book is like 600 pages, 700 pages. And I had worked a little bit behind the scenes on it. And one of his editors told me something that I will phrase diplomatically, but they wanted the help of Judy's family, that Gerald Frank would be given access to Judy's surviving sister, the kids, Sid Luft, the husbands, the ex-husbands, and this was all worked out. But one of those people who was wanted very much for the interview for the book said, "I will only speak to Gerald Frank if he does not discuss Frank Gumb's bisexuality." And this was somebody who was very much wanted for the book. And so the only mention of Frank Gumb's bisexuality comes on like page 672, where Judy once says, was seeking Marcus Rabwin, the doctor who had seen to it that she was born and had been family friend all those decades. And she had sought him out in those last couple of years when things were so rough. And she said, "Dr. Mark, did you ever hear anything about my father being a homosexual?" And Mark Rabwin said to Gerald Frank, "I didn't see what good it would tell her at that point. So I said, not to my knowledge." Now, he might have blown away a lot of clouds at that point, but because he was not under restriction, I don't believe, that the family was. But so he said that much, which was honest. But the fact that, the family couldn't talk about it, and they couldn't talk about Vincent, and they couldn't talk about Sid, and they couldn't talk about Freddie and David, and Tom and Mark and Mickey, and geez. And all these books came out, and some of them sold, a lot of them didn't, because there was such a glut of them between 75 and 2010, 11. So most of this stuff isn't in the books. But Judy's misbehavior and Judy's temperament and Judy's causing difficulties and Judy's unhappiness and Judy's divorcing and Judy's remarrying and Judy having no money, that's all in there. But at whom does the finger get pointed? Judy Garland has her kids put on 6 layers of clothes to sneak out of a hotel because they can't pay the bill. Judy Garland wasn't supposed to pay the bill. She had managers, she had agents, she had husbands for that.
You had touched on the abortion thing. I'd like to talk about that more.
We mentioned that MGM and Judy's mother saw to it that Judy aborted her child by David Rose. A couple of years later, when Judy was seriously involved with Tyrone Power, and he was seriously involved with her, it was not a one-sided thing, she apparently became pregnant again. And because she was not yet divorced from David Rose and he was married as well, she had to have that pregnancy terminated. Then in 1951, when Sid Luft came into her life and was starting to manage her, at her request, she had somebody to run interference and handle all that stuff. He arranged for her first appearance at the Palace Theater. He arranged the booking. Roger Edens and Chuck Walters at MGM put the show together. They were the creative force, and they were Judy's team. But about when they went back to California from New York after booking the Palace so that Judy could rehearse with Chuck and Roger and the dancers, the male backup, Judy found out she was pregnant with Sid's child. And she was still married to Minnelli. They were not divorced. I think Sid was still married to Lynn Barry, possibly not. But obviously she had to have that abortion as well. And this was not in keeping with Judy Garland's heart and soul and what she wanted. Sid later admitted that he wasn't of much support to her. David Rose said the same thing. How Tyrone Power felt, I don't know. But years later, Judy was talking to some fans after a TV taping, and they met in the parking lot by accident. Everybody was going home, but these were fans Judy knew. So they had a long, long conversation. And finally, one of the women, a young mother, said, I've got 6 kids. No, my kids are at home with the babysitter. I've got to go and relieve her. And everybody laughed. And Judy smiled and knew this woman, recognized this woman, and said, how many children do you have? And the woman said 6. The woman later wrote this up for a fanzine, the Garland Gazette, without any other implication. But she said, Judy, I told her, Judy, I have 6 children. And she said, I will never forget the sincere way Judy Garland looked at me and said, you are very fortunate to have 6 children. And when I read that, I was a teenager. But I remember there's something behind that. And whether my intuition is correct or not, I'm not claiming it is, but 6 is the number of children Judy Garland would have had if she had not to have 3 of them aborted. And she loved her children, loved children, period, and hers alone. After everything Liza and Lorna and Joe saw Judy go through, and which they will admit to was rough at times, they will not hear a bad word about their mother. That says something about Judy Garland, too.
There is that rumor that Spencer Tracy had
Oh, God, yes.
molested Judy or was involved with Judy somehow when she was a teenager.
When Judy was just 15, 38-year-old Spencer Tracy was regularly seducing her.
We have talked, or we will be talking, about MGM's spy network and how MGM kept a close watch on all their stars. One of the really preposterous stories about Judy that gets floated about these days, even pre-Wizard of Oz. So not only did she have an abortion during the making of The Wizard of Oz, which she did not, now there are rumors that Spencer Tracy, who was at MGM, was having dates with Judy Garland when she was 13, 14, and 15 years old, and that there was more to these dates than that. And given the fact that Spencer Tracy was married with 2 kids, that Judy Garland was a minor, there's absolutely no way that MGM could not have known about it if it happened, and there's absolutely no way they would have condoned it. They would have, flushed Judy Garland if need be before she became a star. Tracy had his problems, but he and Judy became very good friends. They later made the film Judgment at Nuremberg together, and there are great pictures of them kibitzing on the set, and his quotes about what an actress she was, and how he didn't have much to do in her scenes, but he didn't mind playing stooge to somebody like Judy Garland. But no, the idea that there's this kind of preposterousness going around, it's just, again, Drek of today being tossed at yesterday, and people of yesterday who are in no position to defend themselves. You hear some of the books are so tacky and tawdry that there's no reviewer in the world who believes them, but they still get published and they still get put out there. And I think the Spencer Tracy legend is part of that.
There's countless stories about, Judy tried to commit suicide here, and it seems to be a never-ending sort of thing. And the general sense is that she was just hopelessly suicidal and she was constantly miserable. What do you make of that and that whole world, that narrative?
One of her fans wrote a wonderful article for one of the fanzines about Judy in the 60s when the headlines were one thing after another, and said, certainly if somebody had been as suicidal and had attempted suicide as many times as Judy Garland, she would have been successful once, and once would have been enough. There's just this kind of, she wasn't being foolish or wisecracking. She was just saying, come on, folks, get with it. I think when Judy was medicated and most of her suicide attempts or any suicide attempts came at such a low for her, if you go to the idea of manic depression or bipolar, which certainly touch on some aspects, I think, of Judy Garland. I'm not clinically capable or clinically authorized to say anything like that, but I think the signs were there, and they were all exaggerated and complicated by the medication, by the overwork, by the depression, by everything that was going on. The fact that every time she dug herself out of the hole, and would do her best to start over again. It always slipped away. And how frustrating and how agonizing that must be for a woman who was basically as intelligent as she was, to find out that the helping hands were not there, or the helping hands that she counted on were not as strong as the helping hands she expected them to be. And how much did she dislike herself for making wrong choices again and again and again? It's just, somebody also said that Judy Garland's life was like this huge pressure container. Judy Garland's life was a huge pressure container, and nobody provided a pressure valve, to let it off a little bit. Eliza has said that, Mama's attempts at suicide were, sometimes just, cries for help. Judy said it herself. She also very tellingly told somebody she trusted, who had seen headline after headline after headline. This was right toward the end of her life. And she said quite simply and quite sincerely, "I would never be so foolish as to take my own life." So I think that, again, you have to count on the sanity of Judy Garland that always gave her the perspective, the witticism, the hope to keep on going. The fact that she could convey that hope. I remember that less than a year before she died, she was a guest on Mike Douglas's daily TV show.
Some kind of a clinic. It's Judy Garland.
And they had held up the taping because Judy was not feeling well and was kind of stalling and afraid of going out and having to be Judy Garland. And the Douglas show was not then the big national show it became. And so there weren't, hairdressers and makeup people. And Judy had just gotten out of that last 1968 rehab at Peter Ben Brigham in Boston. And she was very clean and very together, but very frail. She was in good voice and performing well, and she came and sat down, and Mike was asking her questions, and she was laughing a lot with Peter and just having a wonderful time. And then at the end, one of the things Mike Douglas had been told before the show went on the air was, do not do this, do not do that, and do not ask her to sing Over the Rainbow. So, of course, Mike Douglas, being the go-getter that he was, said at the end of the part of her interview, he said, you look like you're very comfortable now. Would you please sing everybody's favorite song? And the audience started to applaud instantly. And she shot him a dirty look. There was this kind of, "You rat," kind of thing. But she agreed.
In this, I must say, in the 6.5 years I've done this show, this has been certainly one of the biggest thrills of my life. And because you look as though you feel very comfortable now, and there's a song, everyone's favorite song from Wizard of Oz. Would you please do it for us? Please. Would you do it?
Now, when that show was on telecast, I was on a road trip with my parents for summer vacation. And I knew she was on because the Garland grapevine was vast and far-reaching. But I was not anywhere near a TV when it was televised in any of the city. It was because it was syndicated. It was on different days in different places. And so I never saw it until, 4 years later.
For once unafraid I can go where life leads me, and somehow I know I'll be strong.
And by golly, this was 10 months before she died. She is very thin. She's frail. She's not professionally made up or lit or coiffed. But she's singing with warmth and vibrato and that great mellow quality, that the voice that could only belong to Judy Garland. And what struck me that day, and I was not prepared for it, because she'd only been gone 4 years. And Boy, did my world change without a Judy Garland in it.
Somewhere over the rainbow, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby.
I had not seen this Mike Douglas appearance, and there she is singing Over the Rainbow and investing it as an actress, as a performer, as herself, with all the hope that is in the song, conveying that no matter what, there is this place over the rainbow. I heard of it once in a lullaby. Skies are blue. The dreams really come true. Someday I'll be there. And she totally conveyed the belief at this stage of her life, at 46 years old, that she had every firm conviction in herself that, yes, she would someday be just fine. That she, don't worry about me. I'm Judy Garland. I'll be here. I'll be here doing what I do. Blew me out of the water.
Someday I wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me.
Basically, what she gave them was carry on, joy, forever. That she was indefatigable, that she was indestructible. I know when I saw her in person, and I couldn't have put this in words at that point. But those two nights, or first night too, in 65, but especially the two nights in 67, and especially the last night in 67, when she had done 3 encores and they brought the house lights up and the asbestos curtain down and nobody would leave. The audience started to chant, 3,600 people ranging in age, as we used to say, from fetal to fatal. Kids there whose parent brought them to see Dorothy, teenagers like myself, all the way up the scale. 3,600 people started to rhythmically clap and chant, "We want Judy, we want Judy, we want Judy." They didn't think they hadn't gotten their money's worth. They just didn't want it to be over. And she came back and sang another song. Meanwhile, there'd already been 3 encores and minutes after minutes after minutes of ovation, and the orchestra playing Over the Rainbow, and Judy coming out and bowing and going back into the wings and coming out, just being a pro. If she had continued to keep coming out of the wings and bowing, we'd all still be there now. Because there was this sense, again, I couldn't have verbalized it, but there was a sense that as long as you could keep her in front of you, she was all right. She was okay. You were taking care of her. There was this sense that this was an invaluable, priceless gift, this woman. As I say, it was like when she went off into the wings, that's when the bad things happened. That's when you couldn't help her. That's when there were headlines. That's when there were challenges. There were difficulties. But as long as you could keep her there in front of you, she didn't have to sing. This was part of it too. People said, well, she can't sing all the time. She can't be Judy Garland all the time. And so one critic said she could have walked across the country, coast to coast, and it sold strawberries to people lined up on either side of the street, and they would have all been there all the way across the country. They just wanted to. There's just something about her. You saw her once in a movie, on TV, whatever, and you didn't forget it. I was privileged 11 years ago to be invited to the TCM Film Festival in Los Angeles to do several appearances, but primarily to do a presentation on Judy. And I walked on to this ovation from these people. And it shook me. I mean, I was all prepared to open with a couple jokey things about who I am and what I've done. I didn't have to. They all knew because they all felt about her the way I did. And you talk about preaching to the converted. I was on for 2 hours and 15 minutes. When it was over, they would not stop asking questions. When it was over, And again, but that has happened again. They don't want to go home. They want to hear. When I do the presentations in Chittenango for the Oz Festival and Grand Rapids for the Garland Festival, Wamego, they will ask questions till the cows come home. You know, tell us. And the fervor. One of my Grand Rapids appearance back in the 90s, jam-packed with fans from all over the world. A whole bunch of people had flown in from England, and I was having lunch with them. We were just getting acquainted, but I was having lunch with them, and this darling little teenage girl came over and knelt beside my chair. She couldn't have been 14, maybe 12, 13. And she reached up and tapped me on the shoulder, and I looked down, and she said, "Is it true that you met Judy Garland?" I said, "Yeah, I did." And she just looked at me and said, "Would you please tell me what it was like?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing a presentation this afternoon. Are you coming?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, when I ask for questions, why don't you ask then? Because a couple of people have asked that, and then I can tell everybody." And she just lit up. And when we went to the presentation, again, they filled the 50 or 75 seats. There were people standing in the back. There were people sitting on the floor to see Judy clips. And a lot of stuff had not been on home video then or on YouTube. But so it was all rare and valuable to everybody. And this little girl was sitting at my feet. I couldn't, I couldn't move during the whole presentation. I had to, because they were all crowded around me. And when it came time for questions, she raised her hand, and I winked at her and said, I'll come back to you, because I thought that would make a good finish. And I told that story. But when I called on her, I said, "Yes, I know you've got a question." And she said, she looked up at me and she said loud enough for the whole room to hear, because they cracked up after she asked me. She said, "Would you please tell us, moment by moment and second by second, every single thing that happened when you met Judy Garland?"
My youngest daughter has a pussycat who takes great pleasure in getting under my feet when I have a hot dish in my hands.
Oh my. And what happens to the dish and to you?
No, I kick the cat.
And everybody talked about her sense of humor. Lucille Ball, I met when her daughter, Lucy Arnaz, was playing the Melody Top Theater, where I did publicity in the 70s. But I had time in the car with Lucille Ball. But on the way back to her hotel at 3 o'clock in the morning, she was talking about how proud she was of her daughter and saying, "Little Lucy, yeah, she was so funny on stage, and then she was funny at dinner tonight." She said, "She's funny." She said, "People always expect me to be funny," me being Lucille Ball. She said, "But I'm not." She said, "The writers were funny. The writers gave me funny things to do, and I could do them, but I'm not funny." And she did not know me from Adam at this point. And we'd been together sporadically for 6 or 7 hours. That was it. 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. And she said, rhetorically, she said, "You know who was really funny?" I said, "No, Lucy, who was really funny?" And she said, "Judy Garland." I almost drove off the street. Not really, but it was just like, "Oh, really?"
Ready? Keep your sunny side up. That's what we're doing. And sing it loud.
And she said, "Oh, Judy Garland, the funniest woman in Hollywood, naturally funny." And she wrapped it up, these 2 or 3 sentences. She said, "Judy Garland made me look like a mortician." When I did the Judy Legendary Film Career book, there's a section on each of her movies. The last one, I Could Go On Singing, was directed in London by Ronald Neame, who did The Poseidon Adventure and he's a classic director. But he was very British and very proper, and she couldn't always get a message as what was she doing all right? He wasn't. She said, "I'm a star. I need to be told that I'm doing, I'm used to people telling me that I'm doing a good job." And she said, all he says is, "Marvelous, Judy, marvelous. Let's do another take. Marvelous." And this went on for some time. He was there one day, and they were doing a take, and Judy did it, and it went very well. And "Marvelous, Judy, marvelous. Let's do it marvelous." And they do it a second time, and did it a third time. And again, she got marvelous. "Let's do it once more." And Judy finally drew herself up to her full 4 feet 11 inches, 5'4" in her 5-inch heels, and said, "Ronnie, you keep saying marvelous, and then we keep doing it again. What are you not getting that you want? You got to tell me. And why do you keep doing it again?" And Ronald Neame looked at her and said, "Oh, well, Judy, let's just say there's a little man inside of me who tells me we should do it again." And Judy looked up at him and said, well, Ronnie, I'm just going to have to crawl inside you and kill that fucking little man. Well, again, one of the problems with imposing innocently the 21st century thoughts of Judy Garland on the 20th century Judy Garland during her lifetime is the Dorothy thing. Now, Wizard of Oz was on TV first in 56, then again in 59, 60, 61, 62, and annually then from 64 to 98, 1998, 39, 40 times. But during Judy's lifetime, it was often a reminder that she was Dorothy Gale once a year. And she would say, you know, when she did a concert in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1965, and there was a whole troop of Girl Scouts there to greet her with their autograph books outstretched. And she got off the plane all beautifully coiffed and the false eyelashes and ready to go to a press conference. And she said, you didn't think I'd look like this, did you? I'm a little older maybe, but the kids didn't care. They knew it was Dorothy. And the Dorothy thing is something that has been repeatedly imposed on her because that's the thing for which she is most legendarily historically known. And she was very defensive about Dorothy. She would never do, they wanted her to do a jokey version of Over the Rainbow on her TV series, and she shot them down. She said, you've got to be kidding. I don't want anybody anywhere to lose the thing they have about Dorothy in that song. That's sacred. And she was very, very grateful for having been Dorothy for the kids. And she knew that that's why she had the teenage audience, that they saw her in the movies and the late show movies and Wizard of Oz once a year. And she used to kid about having to be Dorothy Adorable at press conferences and everything and just, you know, toe the line and be professional, which she always was. But no, she totally embraced Dorothy and the concept of Dorothy. And this is why she only sang Over the Rainbow on television 3 times, once coerced into it by Mike Douglas. The other time when she was doing the Palace Act in her TV debut, when she did it in the tramp costume. And then at the end of her Christmas show of the TV series with Lorna and Joe sitting on either side of her on the sofa. She loved that song. And she would occasionally privately joke about it if somebody was giving her trouble. The drunk woman in the ladies' room who kept telling her, Judy, never forget the rainbow. The rainbow has given me so much. And she knocked on Judy went in the stall. The woman knocked on the door. Judy, don't forget the rainbow. And this went on, 5 times while Judy was in the ladies' room. And finally, as Judy was leaving the ladies' room, the woman said, Judy, you've got to promise me you won't forget the rainbow. And Judy looked at her and said, Madam, how could I forget the rainbow? I've got rainbows up my ass.
The Variety Club saw to it that quite a number of those other less fortunate children won't have a toyless Christmas. Deborah Carr was amongst arrivals at the Savoy Hotel, greeted by the 2 Santas, Dickie Henderson and Tommy Steele. They were collecting toys from the 500 members and guests, including Lord Morrison, at Variety's Christmas luncheon. The toys, 6,000 in all, will go to children in hospitals and orphanages. Judy Garland was there with her gifts.
Her interplay with handicapped children, with crippled children, legions of stories about that. And all she did for them. She got the highest paid price ever paid to an entertainer on the Sunday night at the London Palladium TV show in 1963. When she'd been over there doing I Could Go On Singing in 1962, the thalidomide scare broke, the medication that pregnant women had been taking that resulted in children being born without arms or legs. She donated that whole Palladium salary to the thalidomide children for prosthetics. I'm not saying I'm not trying to canonize her. I'm not saying she was perfect, but boy, you couldn't do everything she did on stage and off and do it the way she did it if you were as substance prone, suicide prone, misery prone as Judy Garland has been rumored to be. When Judy Garland died, and again, it's she killed herself, even though it was emblazoned in the headlines when they did the autopsy and they did the coroner's report, that yes, she had the remains of 8 to 10 Seconal sleeping pills in her system. but these were not all taken at one time. This was not a conscious desire on Judy Garland to kill herself. She would have had to take many more pills than that. There was no alcohol in her system at all. There was no sign of liver damage in her autopsy. And the coroner felt compelled to put this forward because in the 3 days since she died, there were all these headlines. Oh, I treated her. She was living on borrowed time. She was this, she was that. And he had to blow that all out of the water. And it became quite clear. Her doctor said if Judy wanted to get 4 hours of sleep, she had built up such a tolerance to sleeping pills that she had to take 4 pills. And she would wake up after 4 hours and want to go back to sleep and take 4 more or 5 more, whatever. She had a bad throat. She had a sore throat. She had not been eating that day. She was probably on an empty stomach. She was too frail, under 90 pounds at that point. So psychologically keyed to not eat unless you had to eat. There were internal problems. There were all these things that she was facing the last months, the last year, the last years of her life. She went into hospital in summer 1965 and again in summer 1968 to go on withdrawal. There may have been other attempts, but those were the 2 that we know of for sure. She came out clean, but in June 1965, she had to go right back to work, or otherwise the kids wouldn't eat. But again, she was trying. Stay off the pills, get off the pills. But then the pressures would start. And again, could she rest up when she got home from the hospital? No, she flew to Las Vegas within an hour of leaving the hospital. In 1968, she had done 80 concerts in 1967. Again, after being written off when she got fired from the movie Valley of the Dolls, a favor for which we are very, very grateful. And but she went back on the road, played the Palace for the 3rd time here in New York, broke her own box office record. Every performance she was there. 1968 started off rockily because she was so worn out from 67 and she had some career disappointments and no money. She'd worked her, again, 80 concerts and nothing to show for it because the government came in and took everything. And she did a couple of concerts that were very, very good and a couple of concerts where she was obviously medicated. She collapsed on stage, went back into the hospital July 1968, got off all medication, did a concert in Philadelphia to 20,000 people outdoors in great voice, slamming it across, in great shape. She was fine for the next few weeks, but there was no money. She was singing. She was happy. She was not over-medicating. But then she had to go back to work. And she had to go back to work because she didn't have a red cent. There are all kinds of side bits to all of that, but those are the basic things. How hard she tried to take care of herself and finally, I think toward the end, and I'm talking about the very end now, she would take medication to have energy and have sleep because she was physically and emotionally dependent on it. Was she taking fistfuls of them? No. There's all kinds of exaggeration about that.
I get so scared sometimes, Mr. Edens. You see, I don't know where that voice comes from.
It's a gift.
But does that mean it can be taken away?
One of the classic Judy Garland anecdotes comes from one of her greatest film director, George Cukor. But when there were delays from Judy, when she wouldn't come out, we hear these things, she wouldn't come out of her dressing room. She wouldn't come out of her dressing room. George Cukor finally went in to confront her. And as he said, I heard myself saying very tentatively, is there anything wrong? And that cracked her up, as depressed as she was, as unhappy as she was. And she said, that's the story of my life. The world is falling in on me and people want to know if anything's wrong. But he said that basically it was all about her fears. And he said, why? You are so capable. Why are you afraid? And she said a quote that he never forgot. She said, I'm always afraid this is the time they're going to catch me. Meaning I'm going to walk out there and everybody's going to find out I have no talent. The costume designer at MGM, Walter Plunkett, said, when she was doing summer stock that there was one day she was very late and she came in very unnerved and burst into tears. And he said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "I kept driving around the entrance to MGM and I kept looking up at the gate and seeing the time has come, or this is the day they will find you out," something like that. Actors who worked with her, Dirk Bogarde, Jack Carson, so many people said that when Judy wouldn't come out of her dressing room on the set of a film, especially from the mid 40s on, after that first decade, she wasn't being temperamental. She wasn't being a diva. She was scared to death. And when she said, I was able to verbalize it, as "I'm always afraid this is the time we're going to catch me," that was because her talent was, as we have said, so natural. It was such a gift. She had never learned to sing the way she sang. She never learned to act the way she acted. She never learned to be funny. She never learned to draw people to her. This was who she was. This was all part of her. Just what she was fortunate or lucky or blessed to be born having. These were the characteristics of Judy Garland. And the older that she got, she was devastating audiences as Baby Gum, devastating auditions in Hollywood, even if they didn't have a part for her, finally getting in at MGM after the third audition, and parts and triumphing at benefits and leading up to The Wizard of Oz and leading to Judy and Mickey and leading to grade A musicals written by great composers and great screenwriters for her. And then back to the stage when Hollywood thought she was washed up and wasn't having it anymore. Could she go back on the stage? Did she still have what it took to do that? And finding out that that was more potent than ever before. But again, every time she got up, every time she walked out of a dressing room at the Palladium, at Palace, at Carnegie Hall, at MGM, at Warner's, she did not know if it was going to be there, if she was in a good mood, if you'd made her laugh, if you'd made her relax, if you made her comfortable. Everybody said that too. If you could make her laugh, if you could detense her, unwind and get away from the fears, she was brilliant. But you had to do that. She had to be made to feel comfortable. And then she did what she was born to do, but that she had no idea how to do. And I think that was it. She was always afraid that she was going to walk out and not remember how to do what she'd been doing for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40 years. And that's got to be devastating. You pile that on top of, or you build on top of that, the debts and the taxes and the kids and the schedules and the changes and the do this at this way and do that that way. And it just, again, that sensitivity, that concept of herself was something that she didn't believe in until she was in the middle of it. And even then, I don't think she was sure of it. But she didn't know where it came from. How do I go out and do what all these people expect me to do when I don't know how to do it? I think that, again, a reflection of the depth of her emotions, the depth of her intelligence, the depth of her perceptions, and all the hazards that had been put in her way by her own psyche, by her parents, her environment, her studios, all of that, her theaters. A very savvy critic, when she went back to Toronto in 1965, said, how do you explain that the piling, that the foundation of the O'Keeffe Center seemed to supernaturally tremble when she sang? How do you explain that this was all due to one 4'11" woman on stage simply singing songs? How do you measure miracles? This is what she was up against. And when she went back in 1965, it was a challenging engagement for other reasons. But one of the critics writing about it the night before she opened, he said, no wonder Miss Garland, creates headlines and has these ups and downs. He said, she has to match her impact on audiences dating back 30 years. It was an enormous responsibility being Judy Garland. mother, wife, legend, entertainer, singer, actress, comic, dancer, when she was basically a little girl from Grand Rapids, Minnesota. And I don't think she would have traded it. At times she would have, certainly. You compound what was going on inside of her emotionally with, okay, so I go out, get up and go and do these 80 concerts between June 1967 and December 1967. Why? There's not going to be a dollar left for me. I'm going to be in the same situation I am now. I'm still going to owe taxes. I'm still going to not have a home of my own anymore. The night I saw her in Chicago, and I'm sure she had used this line before, but I had not heard it before in another show or on a tape or anything like that. She did like 4 numbers at the top, and she sat down on the edge of the stage, and somebody from the orchestra pit handed her up a glass of water. And meanwhile, a photographer from one of the papers had crept down the aisle and immediately flash cubed, her. And she laughed and she said, they're always waiting for that picture of me with a glass in my hand. And of course, everybody cracked up. But so much aware of her own image and who she wanted to be at her best. Just talking about how the kids were going to be taking over for her. Liza was in California doing the Carol Burnett show, and Lorna and Joe were coming along. And she said, I'm going to retire on the 3 of them pretty soon. And everybody's yelling, no, no, no. She said, I wouldn't leave you. I'd die before I leave you. And she said, and I'm not about to die. And every big ovation. And then she said, no, that won't fit in with my schedule. When my number's up, I want a new one. Again, always the optimism, always the good cheer, always the never say die. Yes, I'm going to make it over the rainbow. Yes, I will be back. Yes, I love you, and I'm glad you love me. When somebody spends their life doing that, being that, giving that, I think she deserves a whole lot of consideration and more gratitude than anybody else has ever been given. And if I sound like a fan and an advocate and an adulator, I am very proud of that fact. It's a crazy story. And if you look at it in the right and proper way, it's a very inspirational story. And a story, as Judy said on her last birthday, I'm 47 years old, and with my life, that makes me just about 412. So don't tell me she died young. By whose standards? Who else accomplished? I put this litany in the introduction of the first Garland book I did. Judy Garland worked for 45 or for 47 years. She appeared in 34 feature films. As an adult, she did over 1,100 concerts, fulfilling 93% of the engagements that were booked for her. She did 30 television shows of her own and did guest appearances on 30 more. She recorded 70 or 80 sides for Decca Records, 12 albums for Capitol. Before, she did 3 Army camp tours during World War II and a coast-to-coast war bond all-star tour that raised over $1 billion in war bonds sold. 200-plus network radio shows with material that was new. That's what she accomplished, plus 3 kids, plus having to lose 3 kids, plus 5 husbands, lawsuits, crazy agents, no money, Louis B. Mayer, MGM, all of it. And she gets immortality, we get all of that work. And she deserves the truth.
Happy little bluebirds fly
Beyond the rainbow, we can all do it, Why, oh, why can't